Welcome everyone to this newest edition of the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast. This is your host Andre Joseph of AJ Epics Productions, and I'm here again today with my partner in crime, Mr. Albert Albanese. Say hello.
Hey, what's going on, guys?
So with this episode, we're going to be breaking a little bit of tradition. Normally we talk about movie licensed action figures, and we'll still tie into that, but for today's topic, every episode we always like to talk about the toys that we wish we had as kids, but we never really got too deep into what happens when you could actually create your own action figures or find somebody that can make an action figure of something you've always wanted, but the toy companies never produced. And I'd say to kind of start this off, I want to do a little bit of a post-mortem because, recently, as some people might know from past episodes, Albert and I are big wrestling fans, and we also used to collect a lot of the old action figures from LJN, Hasbro, Jakks, most recently Mattel, and for about 3 years now, Mattel's been making these retro style WWE action figures in the style of the 1990s Hasbro sets, and this whole line was really amazing to have. It brought back the memories of going to the KB toy stores or Toys R Us, getting those 3 for $5 deals, and completing our old collections, because there was a certain point when they stopped making the Hasbros and we kind of moved on to the Jakks figures, but we always kind of wanted to, because they're more playable, we wanted more of those wrestlers to come out as new guys were coming in or old guys were getting new costumes. And, this Mattel line kind of brought all that back to life. But sadly, they recently announced that they're putting the line on ice. So it may not be completely dead, but for the time being, this recent Series 10 set is considered to be the last one, as they're moving on to making a Ghostbusters tie-in of wrestling figures, which looks cool, but it's not something that I feel like I would have to go out and I have to get. So what are your thoughts with the retro figures for the little time that we had them, Albert?
So my thing was that I actually started a little bit late when it came to the retros, because as a kid I had all the Hasbros, but I always thought to myself, I know that that's an expensive venture to go down to get all these Hasbro figures back from my childhood. For those of you guys who don't collect or aren't really aware, the prices on some of these guys are pretty expensive, especially the last 2 sets, the last set being the most expensive because they were very hard to find, and there's a limited amount of quantities out there that people actually do own. So I thought to myself, well, you know what, if I'm not going to go back and collect the Hasbros, I'm not going to get the retros. And then to give a little bit of a plug to a big podcast that Andre and I are a big fan of, the Major Wrestling Figure podcast with pro wrestlers Kurt Hawkins and Zack Ryder, started talking about how those are the same figures from their childhood and how much they love the retro line and how much they are hoping that fans were going to support the retro line. And I thought to myself, you know what, I gotta go and get these. And I spent, because I was a little bit behind the 8 ball when it came to starting to collect these, I spent a decent amount of money getting the first couple of series because I really wanted to have the entire collection. When San Diego Comic-Con, which was last week actually, came out, Andre and I were talking about how excited we both were to see what new retros were going to be put out. And when it turned out that there wasn't any and they were going to put this line on hiatus, it kind of broke my heart a little bit. It's one of those things where it really brought back my love of collecting, because as a wrestling figure collector, I've started to kind of wean off on a lot of the stuff that I've collected because it's a very slippery slope. You can wind up spending a lot of money if you want to get everything. So I decided that I was going to collect basic and elites of current superstars on the roster. Some of the old school guys who I just never had as a kid growing up. And I got into the retros. And the retros were the ones that really made me feel like a kid again. Going to the store, hunting them down, trying to find them, see if they were going to be on the shelves. That feeling that you had when you were a kid, when you would go to a toy store and you'd find exactly what you were looking for. And then, you pick it up and you get it, you buy it and you get to open it. It's you bring back that feeling of nostalgia as a child. So it really hurts me that they put these on ice, but I'm really hoping that this isn't the end, and we're gonna wind up getting more of these in the future. Maybe, maybe they'll take a hiatus for a year and then come back and figure out the ways that they can better distribute these figures, because I think that's what really killed this line was the distribution problems.
I totally agree on that. Like when this line first began, I remember seeing the pictures, and I was like, on one hand, I was excited, but on the other hand, I was very skeptical, because I remember when Jakks did their LJN style action figures for the classic line, and I ended up picking up the Shawn Michaels, The Rock, and the Steve Austin, and the Undertaker. And while they were cool to kind of have, they weren't exactly to the size or even the feel of the old school LJN WWF figures. So at a certain point, I just stopped collecting those, and I was kind of worried that Hasbro, they say these are going to be like the Mattel figures were going to be just like the Hasbros, and I wasn't so sure if they were going to get the size right, if they were going to get the molding correct. And lo and behold, when I did pick up the first few that came out, I was like, holy shit, I could put this in my display case, and it feels like a continuation of where I left off. The poses, the overall look and the scheme of each figure. And, again, the way that they would go back into wrestlers from the Attitude Era, from the New Generation era that we didn't get at that time, and at the same time, propelling into the current roster of wrestlers and making it feel like they were part of the old school roster. I mean, it was really cool. And then bringing back the ring, they really did a bang up job with this. But again, like you said, it was always such a difficulty to get these toys, because everything was either an online exclusive or you had to find a Target or a Walmart to get them. And the worst part was, like, something like Ringside Collectibles would have the figures for Series 5, months before they would hit the toy shelves. And I think that made it more difficult if you just want to buy it in the store versus, having to pay ridiculous amounts of money online to get an entire set or even an individual figure. I wish that's the only thing that I wish that they would handle better, is the distribution part of it. And some might say it's because of wrestling's current state and popularity at the moment, but I think that's only one factor. It was definitely the fact that these figures were more geared towards the older collectors, whereas the young kids, they just didn't understand it. They want to get the elite set. They want to get like the current figures that they make, and they're great. I mean, look, Mattel has done an amazing job with getting the likenesses correct on all these wrestlers and the playability factor. But I'm just an old school guy, so when I saw these figures, I had to finish the set. So, I mean, it's going to be missed, and I wish that they could bring it back right away, because there's a lot of these figures we're only finding out about now that Hasbro was supposed to do, but they stopped production, that I wish they could continue with, like they did with the Diesel figure. So we're going to be talking more about this as we go along.
Yeah, it's one of those situations, I think, Andre, where, this is one of those things where it really struck a chord with older collectors, and I wonder if that's the reason why the line didn't succeed, because I think that Mattel might have initially thought that this was something that was going to be more geared towards kids, but they didn't realize that older collectors were the ones that were definitely going to be more into this than anything else. We were the ones who had these as kids, so we were going to want to collect them again. So I hope that they understand that even I'm okay with them being an online exclusive if that's the case. I just want more.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, people like kids who might be listening to this might just not understand, like, they're just these little plastic things. They don't look like the wrestlers. They only have like limited poses. Well, I'm going to take you guys back, because this is actually going to start to segue into today's topic. So I was a wrestling fan when I was very young, but I wasn't like superbly into it like most people are today. I was kind of in and out of it. I remember when the Hasbro action figures came out around 1990, and there was a Spencer gift store, which actually is still there in the Staten Island Mall, and that's where I got a Hulk Hogan and $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. Those were the only two figures I had at first, so I played with them for a bit before I got bored, and then started using them for other, playtime things, especially the Ted DiBiase. I would always make the bad guy in any kind of scenario that I would have, like make him into the villain from Die Hard or something like that, because he looked like Alan Rickman to some extent. So I only collected them just for that brief moment. I could have gotten an Andre the Giant back then, not knowing how expensive it was going to be, or that he was going to die like 3 years later. But at the time, it was pretty easy to get. And, so like I said, I was in and out of wrestling for a bit. And then 1994 rolled around. And this was at the time when Bret the Hitman Hart was the number one guy. And he was feuding with his brother, the late, great Owen Hart. And my cousin was watching wrestling on a weekly basis. One of my neighbors was also a big wrestling fan at the time. And the next thing you know, because they were watching it, I started watching it and started to get into that current roster at the time with Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon, Diesel, and the 1-2-3 Kid. So the next thing you know, like anything, once you get into a certain trend, you're going to want to start buying up the merchandise around that trend. And at that time, Hasbro was still making the figures, and they were still accessible in Toys R Us and KB Toys. But at that point, the sales were already in decline because wrestling was not as popular as it used to be. So you're only lucky if you could get what you can get in the store. So like what you're going through right now, Albert, going to the flea markets or going through the Facebook pages, I was like literally having to skim through the flea markets, the toy fairs, and virtually any place that just had these things on discount. And then one day, me and my dad, we found out about this place in Toy Fair magazine, this place called MVP. It was like a sports memorabilia store, I believe in Woodbridge, New Jersey. And we go there to see if we can find some additional action figures, because I think at this point, this is when the green card set came out with the 1-2-3 Kid, Smoking Guns, and as it so happened, so we go there, and they had everything. They had the LJNs, they had the Hasbros, but then they also had all these other figures that I had never seen before. And there was like, there was a Diesel figure there, but it didn't look like something that Hasbro made. And then as it turned out, this guy, I'm blanking on his name right now, but I mean, I would give a shout out to him if he ever listens to this. But he had taken a Razor Ramon action figure, he put some hard clay over the head, repainted the body, and turned it into Big Daddy Cool Diesel. So I was like, oh wow. So next thing you know, I find out he's making all these wrestling figures out of guys that were either not produced by Hasbro or quite simply just were in different promotions. So I remember like we were trying to get the 1-2-3 Kid figure. Everywhere you go, it was either overly expensive or you just couldn't find it. Now, if you know about the wrestling figures, they had that tendency to take molds and recycle them for other wrestlers. And this would be the case with a lot of toy lines. So they knew that, okay, they used the same mold as Ric Flair and Ravishing Rick Rude. Like the headlock pose. So what they did was they got a 1-2-3 Kid figure, and my dad, who is a dentist, he was able to, make like plastic molds because, he does like molding for teeth. He got the figure borrowed, and he was able to make molds of the 1-2-3 Kid's head, and then he would give it to these guys, and they would start taking the Ric Flair figures, paint over Ric Flair's body with the 1-2-3 Kid outfit. And lo and behold, they started selling these things like it was an authentic figure. If you ever saw it, and I have one of them, it's pretty damn like what Hasbro was making. Now, this might be kind of illegal, so I think we're way beyond the statute of limitations here. But it was just one of those things where it was like, if you wanted more characters, if you wanted to fill out that line and be like that kid on the block that says, oh yeah, I got a Diesel, I got a 1-2-3 Kid, I mean, that just made your collection very much more special than it already was with what was being produced at the time.
It's true. A lot of people back in the day. So now, the thing about the Hasbros that is crazy to me was that they were so readily accessible back in the day that there were the ability for these people to make all these customs and all these molds for different people and everything. And it was one of those situations where you're like, oh man, now that I'm thinking about this, I kind of wish they didn't, because now there's less around for me to collect now, because I want the original ones. But it was awesome. You would go, there were people in my school, when I was a kid, who were making, customs out of all these Hasbro figures and selling them. I never really got into them, because I was more of an authentic collector. But the other thing was that I started trying my hand into customizing figures. But this was after the Hasbro phase had gone on. But when it comes to Hasbro's, the idea of seeing something like a customized figure, some of these were done so well, you couldn't tell at all. And nowadays, if you go on, and I'm telling you, if you just look on Facebook groups for anybody who collects wrestling figures, if you can find any wrestling figure collection site, there's bound to be 7 or 8 unbelievable customizers on those sites that can pretty much almost make you anything you want.
Yeah, they're more readily accessible today than they were back in those days. And, at the same time, I think this is also where I started to learn appreciation for being a toy collector. Because, again, you would want to buy the toys just so you could play with them. Because I had the King of the Ring play set of the ring that was in yellow instead of blue. And, I bounced these guys around like I would normally do. But something did change when I got some of these customs. Like, I remember the same place made me a Hakushi figure. And what I think they did was they took, like, the body of, I think, El Matador, and they basically got, like, they molded the head, and then they painted all, like, the tattoos of the Chinese symbols on the body, painted the pants white. And so now I had a Hakushi action figure. Now I felt like I didn't want to play with it because it was just so nicely made and it was so nicely painted that to have this thing get bumped around and chipped away, I just, after a while, it's like, okay, I'd rather just have this as a display set as opposed to just playing with them in the ring. And that was also the case where they would be molded in a manner where you couldn't really move them too much, or else they would break much more easier. So they really were designing it not just so much so kids could say that they have those characters, but it was more about just the artwork aspect of it, which I think was really the standout of any of these wrestling figures, and even stuff that you see now, like when they recreate the packaging of these toys and to do it in the style of those old school figures. And you not only see it with the WWF, but you also see it with like the Star Wars set, you see it with like the Kenner Superpowers. Like, they're really recreating this stuff like it was back in the day. And that became even more apparent like when they started, the same place in Woodbridge was also doing the LJNs. Because the LJN figures were even more like so rigid and basically one fixed mold that there really wasn't a whole lot you could do. So they would actually restore a lot of those figures that I had collected and repainted them, polished them. And sometimes they would even tell me, like, if I got a certain figure, if I got a little bit of a scam going on. So I remember this one story when I was in grammar school, and one of my friends had a bunch of these LJN figures, and he was trying to get rid of them. So he gave me his Heart Foundation, and he gave me a couple of others. Just like, he didn't even want money for them. He just gave them to me because he was just trying to clean out his room. And he told me he had Ultimate Warrior. So like, oh yeah, let me get the Ultimate Warrior figure. When he gave it to me, there was something kind of weird about it. He had like a singlet, and he had the face paint, but the face paint looked like it was drawn on, but I'm thinking, okay, well, he's got long hair, he's posed like Hercules, maybe this is him. I go to these guys, I bring the figure, and they told me, oh no, this is not Ultimate Warrior, this is Ken Patera. He took a Ken Patera figure and he painted the face paint over him and told you this was Ultimate Warrior. So they restored that one, and then eventually they did get the actual LJN Ultimate Warrior figure, and it wasn't cheap, but I was able to collect it and finish off that set from there. But that's the sort of thing that would happen all the time, is like when your friends would tell you, oh yeah, we got so-and-so, and they don't tell you that they made it on their own. So that was always sort of like one of the funny things I remember about these guys. They could easily spot a fake whenever it came in.
I mean, for me, I was more of a, I got more into the customizing game when I started collecting the next series of WWE figures that came out, the Bone Crunchers, which Jakks Pacific got the license from Hasbro, and they started coming out with these newer figures, which were bigger. They were around 6 inches, and the playability on these was so much better. So if you guys don't exactly know what the Hasbro figures kind of look like, they had different actions. So, you'd have a guy who you can pull back and throw a punch, and you had a guy who, if you twisted his hip, can throw a clothesline, and you had guys who, if you lifted an arm, can stomp their foot down. So those were the only things you could really do as far as actions. Their arms moved, but for the most part, for all of them, their legs really didn't. So it was very hard to play with them. It was better than, the LJN figures were just giant and rubber, like Andre was talking about with the Kempatera. They really didn't have much action, but at all. But at least these new ones, you actually move them around and do a little bit of different things with. So when the Bone Crunchers came out, which was with the Jakks Pacific license started, these were a game changer.
Oh yeah.
The heads looked, the molds looked better. The faces look a lot better. Some better than others. Some look horrible. Some look great. Depending upon what you got. But their legs moved. Their arms moved. They had 5 points of articulation. And and now you can really start building your figure federation. And once those came out, I remember my cousin got the first Shawn Michaels. He had, I guess his mom had saw it in the store, picked it up for him, and me and my two cousins were looking at it like, this is a game changer. Like, what? Like, he's not the size of any of our other wrestling figures, so we can't use him. We need to get all the other ones, and so we can use them with them. But this is like the new thing. And I remember I got one of the first ever 4-packs that they made, which was Ultimate Warrior, Goldust, Bret Hart, and Shawn Michaels at Christmas time. And those were my first 4 Jakks Pacific figures. Then my collection grew. And as a collection grows, the roster in the WWF grows. And now all of a sudden, there are guys who I wanted that didn't come out yet. And the first one that really struck hard was Stone Cold Steve Austin, but it was really hard to make a custom of him because there really wasn't any bald guys made, so it was a little hard. But the next guy that really debuted that was a big deal that nobody had yet that didn't get into the line was Kane. I had about 4 different Undertaker figures. So I said, okay, let's take one of these Kanes, these Undertakers, and we'll make them Kane. And that's the first ever custom I did. It was the shirt and tie Undertaker. I painted over the tie. I made it all, and striped it black and red. I put the Kane face paint on the Undertaker figure. I painted over the purple gloves and made them black. And that was my Kane for a long time. And that's the first custom I ever did. And I'll never forget that. That's when I realized I might start getting a bunch of these other guys and start just doing this because this is a lot of fun.
Yeah, and like when they did stop making the Bone Crunchers and they started making like the Titantron figures, did you find yourself wanting to do more customs of the Bone Crunchers? Because I definitely felt, for me, not that I tried to do that stuff on my own, but I felt like when they started transitioning to that point, I still wanted the Bone Crunchers to continue. Like, I was already building up the set, I was already doing my own fed, like you said, and I didn't really want that to stop. Like, once they started making these figures taller and, having to restart the whole thing, I just was, like, kind of discouraged at that point.
I agree. It was a little bittersweet. When I first saw the Titantron ones come in, the first thing I thought of was, these are cool. The knees bend. So that's a really big deal. I can do a lot more stuff, Obviously, everything is imagination. We've talked about this multiple times on this show. Everything is about imagination when it comes to playing with your action figures. I've talked about how when I was younger, I had, my Hasbros, and I had all my other, action figures, and they were all in one big wrestling organization. And I have I have the Ninja Turtles versus the Ghostbusters as one of my main events, and Dick Tracy was facing Skeletor for the world title. You imagine everything, and you take all these figures and you use your imagination for getting all of them or whatever, and integrating other figures into your federation. But it was difficult sometimes from a playability standpoint, because if you're a wrestling fan and you have a guy like Triple H whose moves, his big moves, he drops to his knees, it's weird to do that with figures whose knees don't bend. And I remember getting my Triple H for the first time with the Titantron figures and doing the pedigree move, and I was like, oh, this is it. This is a game changer. Now, after the Titantrons went on, and we started getting the RAs and the more deluxe guys, Jakks did a better job with getting more articulation, bending joints in the arms, the heads moving, eventually some at points ankles and torso movements, upper chest movements, all these different things so that you can really pose them and put them into different moves, and you can pretty much do whatever you wanted. But there's something nostalgic about the Bone Crunchers, to the point where they're still, to this day, if I had to go back and say what are my favorite figures ever to play with, it's the Bone Crunchers. There's just something about, and I did get into customizing a lot after that, because I had a lot of extra Bone Crunchers. I started integrating these bigger Titantron figures into my organization, but it was hard to, to just, you had to just put them in, and you had to just deal with, unfortunately, the scaling issue. But, what am I supposed to do? Just write out everybody else into, in my organization and, start anew? So I just integrated everybody in, and I started taking some of the other guys and started customizing them to be guys that, weren't made in either of those lines yet.
Yeah, so, I would say for me, one of the things that would always drive me nuts is when you find out that certain companies were supposed to make certain figures, but they were never released, right? So I remember when I was at a toy fair in Jersey, and they had a couple of the LJN figures in the cart, including the last set, which they called Wrestling Superstars 89. So that's the one that had the Ultimate Warrior, Rick Rude, Haku was in the line. You see, like at that point, the LJN sales started to dip, and it was a year before the license went over to Hasbro. So I remember looking at one of these cards, because I was just checking it out. Keep in mind, now, for people who don't really know a whole lot about the LJN figures, when it came to the tag teams, they only released, when it came to Demolition, they only released Axe. And then with the Powers of Pain, they only released the Warlord. So it was kind of a weird thing where we didn't get the other halves of those teams. As it turned out, when I found out, when I saw one of these figures in the card, I look on the back, and not only did I see that the other halves of those teams were supposed to have their figures come out, but apparently there were pictures of other guys that they didn't make, like Brother Love and the Bushwhackers and Bad News Brown. So I'm like, okay, I go back to my guy at MVP, and I'm like, well, where are these guys? We got to get these figures. So that's when he told me that basically they were set to be released, but there's no pictures of them. We don't even know if they were ever really produced. But apparently that was pretty much at the point when LJN lost their license and they couldn't finish the set. So fortunately, he was able to take a Demolition Axe figure, and he just repainted the face to look like Smash, so at least I could have a Smash figure, and he changed up one of the arms so it could look a little different. It got a little bit crazier, I think, in years later with the Hasbro figures, because, there's that one catalog from Toys R Us, which I think was either in 1990 or 1991. This is when they started putting out the 2 packs of the tag teams. Honky Tonk Man was teamed up with Greg the Hammer Valentine, and they were the tag team Rhythm and Blues. So they had like their little Elvis jumpsuits and whatnot, and Greg Valentine was dressed up like he's Elvis, and he had black hair and stuff. So they never released that Greg the Hammer Valentine figure because the team had broken up. And then when they did put him out, he was just normal Greg the Hammer Valentine with the blonde hair. And so everybody that I know, especially on these Facebook pages, started taken Greg Valentine toys, or at least taken the head and trying to create this thing. And then we've seen even on eBay that there's somebody out there that's selling the actual prototype for like $2,000, which is crazy. But I mean, that's the sort of stuff that's out there. Is like when people find out that there were these other figures and there's these blueprints out there. Case in point with the last set of figures that Hasbro was supposed to make with Diesel, the not 1, 2, 3 Kid, Men on a Mission, Bash Your Booger. It was like, why did we get these guys? Why can't we have these guys now? So stuff like that had an influence on companies like Mattel, who would go and they would look and say, oh yeah, people want this, so they end up making a Diesel close to the Diesel that Hasbro was supposed to make. So like that was always like that little bit of frustration. Like, we should have gotten these back then, and now we're like trying to find people that can create these things and say, hey, could you create this for me so I can finish off the set? A little fun, but also a little frustrating at the same time.
So I was, my first figures, obviously, same as you with the LJNs when it came to the WWE figures. After the LJNs, I collected, the Hasbros, but I really wasn't, I wasn't such a completionist with the LJNs because, in all honesty, as weird as this may sound to people, my LJNs were hand-me-downs from my older sister, who was a big wrestling fan, and then she kind of fell out of it, and I kind of really got into it, and she was like, oh, here, take these, I'm obviously, not going to use them, so, they're yours now. So that was, those were my first real wrestling figures. But after that, I started, really getting deep into the Hasbros, and I was obsessed with trying to get every possible Hasbro that there was. And I wound up that I lost the majority of my collection. But when those, when the idea when the retros came out, the first thing I thought of was, oh man, we actually might wind up getting some of these retro figures, and they could be made like these Hasbros. We're gonna get guys that I wanted to get made back in the day, made now. And it really happened. Diesel was the big one because there was plans for Diesel to be released. Another big one for me was Goldust, because he was a huge character back in the time when the Hasbros were still on the production line, and we didn't have a Goldust, and once I got that, I looked at it and I went, this is something that 11, 12-year-old Albert would have been so excited about having. So it was like a sign of nostalgia when these things came out, and that's what where I think the retro line did it right. They gave us characters that we all wanted, and they also made some characters that were supposed to happen. And we know that there's been rumblings that they were going to make a couple of more in the coming sets of some of those ones that were announced. We know that they have the license for Mabel from Men on a Mission, because they're making all these Mabel and Viscera figures. Mm-hmm. We know that Jeff Jarrett signed a Legends deal with the WWE, so he might start getting some figures of his own made. That's a big deal for us wrestling fans. We're really looking forward to these. The one thing I would like to see, though, is the WWE give Mattel the option to maybe go back and start redoing the Bone Crunchers or the LJN sets and get some of the ones that we wanted that never got released either.
Yeah. I mean, I would even go as far, like with LJNs, to say that when they came out, they were initially successful because of, Hulk Hogan's popularity and the whole rock and wrestling phase. And then at a certain point, I think 2 years in, they started losing popularity, even though LJN still kept making them. And I think part of that was because they were trying to tie the toys with the Hulk Hogan's rock and wrestling cartoon. Because I've seen an LJN catalog, like when they were making the bendable figures at the time, which were sort of the same height as the Hasbros, they were also planning to make the vehicles from that cartoon. Like Hulk Hogan had the that Cadillac Roadster and the motorcycles. They were supposed to do all that, and we never got those. But I've also seen online like people who've actually tried to make custom wrestling figures based on the Hulk Hogan's Rock and Wrestling cartoon, which are unbelievable. And they've even gone as far as taking like the actual artwork from that cartoon, like that style, and trying to put that on current wrestlers as well as guys that were around back in the 80s but never appeared on the cartoons. So I've seen versions of like the Hart Foundation and Randy Savage and Elizabeth. It's really mind-blowing. It really like gives you an imagination of what the possibilities would have been like back then if they had expanded the line to that degree. But you know, it's not just all about wrestling here. You know, like so many different toy lines have had figures that never came out or were planned but never released. You know, and I think when it comes to Star Wars, for example, now they went crazy on the merchandise, as we know, and certainly as the year winds up, we will talk about the Star Wars figures in more detail. But one thing I could definitely say is that they made so many characters from the movie into action figures, but we never had a Grand Moff Tarkin figure, the Peter Cushing character from the original film. I never understood that for the longest time. But when I would go to toy fairs, there would be people that would have these customized versions of him in the old school Star Wars packaging. They would even make their own George Lucas figures. Like they would take Lando Calrissian body and then they would take like, you know, some mold of a guy with a beard, paint his face black so it could look like George Lucas just for fun. And they would sell it off like it was a real Kenner figure. Now, Hasbro recently released these retro sets of the old Star Wars figures in the old molds, and you know, basically they're identical to what they had back in 1977, 1978. But they also made a Tarkin figure, and that was the only one that I collected just so I could feel like I completed the set. And you know, that to me says a lot about how the craze of the custom toys has now had this influence on the actual companies themselves, where they're going out, they're listening to older collectors, they're seeing what they're making out there and like, well, we got to do this for ourselves, we got to sell this legitimately. And I think that makes it more exciting to be a collector in that sense, because now it's like, okay, now they're listening to what the fans want and they're actually going out and they're making the stuff for real. It almost makes it a little competitive for the guys doing it on the custom side. So I always found that to be pretty interesting.
You know, I really like that you brought that up because, you know, I think what we've realized now is that there are some incredibly talented people out there that can make incredibly realistic customs that it's almost to a point where you couldn't even tell that, oh, these things are actually customs. These aren't real figures, kind of a deal. And I know we're talking about Star Wars here a little bit, but I'll bring it back to wrestling just real quick.
Yeah.
There's a guy by the name of Danny Cage who runs He runs Hasbro Maniacs, and he puts out these custom card backs look exactly like the card backs that we had as kids for our Hasbro figures. And if they're replicating card backs and the figures, I mean, it almost like it recreated what we had. And I think that's a big deal for collectors, because back in the day, especially when it came to the Hasbro line, when Stone Cold Steve Austin was, huge and people were still using their Hasbros, people were like scraping the faces off of the Warlord figure because he was the only bald guy with a goatee, and making Stone Cold figures. And then we got an actual retro Stone Cold. I think what we're seeing now is that more of these people who are really talented, when it comes to doing customs. There's also a guy online whose name goes by the name of Scribbles Customs, and he does unbelievable work with the Mattel line to make some current figures of guys that aren't WWE superstars, or older incarnations or newer incarnations of some of these guys, gear and stuff like that. That they're doing such a phenomenal job. It's forcing these guys that are running these toy companies to almost, go out and do the same thing, because they know that there's a serious market for these kinds of things. And it's going to be really surprising to see if, companies that make figures like Star Wars, Ghostbusters, Ninja Turtles go out and they, recreate some of the figures that we wanted to see from when we were kids, because they know that now adult collectors are the market for them.
Yeah, and then I've also seen other companies and guys that, like you mentioned, that have actually taken it one step further. And I bring the case in point, the Zombie Sailor. So this guy I met over at New York Comic Con back in 2017, and he was famous because he was the one who uncovered the blueprints for the WWF Orange Card figures. Like I said, that had Jeff Jarrett, Bastion Booger, Diesel, and like I remember talking to him, and I'm like, "Yeah, you got these blueprints. You're going to start making the figures themselves." I'm like, "Well, no, we don't want to get in trouble with Hasbro." But the thing is, he's also close friends with this guy Ron Rudat, and Ron Rudat was one of the people who worked at Hasbro back in the '90s, who went and designed each of the figures that Hasbro put out. So they did something very interesting. They started making like these little pins, and the pins would be based on the actual blueprints of those figures, and they would also do a Greg the Hammer Valentine pin. They decided to take it one step further and said, okay, let's do a what if scenario. Let's take the next set of new generation guys and let's see how they would look if they had figures back then, but only do them as pins. So they created 6 pins that look unbelievably amazing. Like, again, this is the stuff that we wish we had. They made Undertaker with the Phantom of the Opera mask. They made a Savio Vega. They made Mantar. They made Henry Godwin, Hakushi, and Duke the Dumpster Drosy. And they did them in the molds and the poses like they would have looked if Hasbro had produced them, except this is totally original. This is made now, not back then. So, these guys are really doing their research. They're going out, they're contacting these people who used to work for these companies, and they're getting the stories, they're getting all the info, and they're starting to really take the customization game to a whole new level.
And I think that's what's needed to be done nowadays, Andre, because let's face it, we're, at our ages now, I'm not going to go out and reveal both of our ages. Actually, I don't care. I'll be 34 in a couple of weeks. We know what we wanted as kids. And there's a part of us that knows that we could actually complete our collection, or to even, I know that, hearing stories from these guys, hearing interviews, talking to certain people that listening to certain people who worked in the who would have been coming next is so interesting to me, because I wanted to know. We're now of that age where we know how these things work a little bit better, and it's not just, we're collectors. It's, hey, all right, we know we're collectors, but we know how the inner workings of these companies are. Let me hear from some of these guys who are actually a part of these lines, and see what they had planned, what could have been next, who could have been next, because I want to know these things, and it'd be great to see. It's great to see that some of these guys are so talented that they can make customs or even these pins of some of these figures that we could have had back in the day that we're never going to get a chance to see because they'll never see the light of day.
Yeah, and then, at a certain point for me, I want to get into the game myself because, as people know, I'm a filmmaker, and, one of my dreams for the longest time was to one day make that big film that would have the kind of merchandising that Star Wars or Indiana Jones or even the wrestling figures would have. So when I did my second film, Dishonorable Vendetta, one of the things I said to myself was, okay, I want to take it another step further than what I did in my last movie, and I actually want to try to sell some merchandise, or at the very least, do something that feels close to that. And my big thing was I wanted to do action figures for this movie. And I went out and I started looking at all these different companies like That'sMyFace.com and see some other places that do custom figures. And of course, everybody's expensive, to go and to buy the parts and then to try to mold the heads to look like the actors in your movie. It's obviously not cheap. But then I remember I was on eBay one day and I found this guy, Fred Tosi, who lives in Florida. And he was selling a lot of Star Wars, Indiana Jones, G.I. Joe figures, all the 3/4 inch stuff. But he was also making, before, Super 7 started doing their reaction line, he was going and he was taking the G.I. Joes and the Star Wars figures, and he was creating customized movie action figures for movies like Dirty Harry and Lethal Weapon and Bloodsport and Evil Dead and so on. And he was even recreating the cards. He was even taking Indiana Jones figures and recreating the old Kenner cards. So it was like really amazing work that this guy was putting into it and selling it off. So I said, how much would it cost to do a custom? And, he gave me a price. So I said, okay, I want to do a bunch of G.I. Joe style figures for my movie Dishonorable Vendetta, and I want them to have close to the likeness of my actors. And he did that. And, I'll show a little bit of pictures once this video is fully edited. But he did an amazing job for me in taking my poster and turning it into an actual Star Wars packaging. And to have each of the figures look close to the way we did, but in that vintage 1970s, 1980s style. And I didn't go and get them mass produced because we didn't have the budget for it. But even just as a thank you to my actors, I felt like it was a nice gift for them to have, because again, it was that feeling I wanted to have as a kid to make a movie. And I know you have your own set of figures that I made for you, Albert. So, I still have all mine in plastic display cases. And I'm intending to do something like that again in the near future one of these days.
So, first and foremost, I've said this about 100 times, but I thanked Andre the second that he came up with that idea, because as you obviously know, Andre and I doing this podcast together, that I think that kind of shows that me and him are huge fans of action figures. And I think that, when you're a kid, what's the one thing you always want? You want a toy of yourself. Like, I wanted to be a wrestler. I wanted to be in the Ninja Turtles. I wanted to be in the Ghostbusters. So Andre actually made that come true for me, and I have one in the package and one out of the package figure of myself, and it's the absolute coolest thing ever. There is a part of me that also, getting into the customizing game and stuff like that, and wanting to try to actually, customize figures myself. I wanted to try to make, a series of every, a figure of myself for every series of, figures that I had played with as a kid. But to have one that's actually specifically made, and that's me, that's not anybody else, that's, my character from that movie, that's me. It's the coolest thing ever. And, Andre, again, thank you for making that happen, because that's the dream. When I was a kid, I was like, Andre and I always talk about how it's funny how we both grew up in Staten Island, didn't know each other, but we're very similar in a sense that we kind of both were into the same things. Like, we both loved action figures. We both loved pro wrestling. We both, liked all these things. And, we kind of never met. But, here we are later in life, and Andre made my dream come true of making myself into an action figure. And that's something that I would love to have happen again, because I love that figure. I still have it displayed in my room. It'll never go anywhere. It's the one figure that I know that, like, even if I couldn't display any of my collection, that's the one I will, because that's me.
Yeah, man, it's definitely my pleasure to have done that. And like I said, I really, like, it was always one of my dreams to do like my own AJ Epic's toy division, just so I could only, like, the way Todd McFarlane has his toy line, which he's been doing forever and does amazing work with not just the Spawn toys, but virtually everything from like Walking Dead and, list goes on. And, it really is like, collecting toys has been a big part of the reason that I got into making movies, just buying the toys, creating those storylines and my own storylines in my room. And sometimes you come with my own ideas that will become scripts later on. So, for me, it's always been like such an importance of my upbringing. And it's something that I'd like to keep doing. Now you got these 3D printers. I don't have one personally, but it's something I'd like to have so I could really do it on my own, put the work into painting the figures and molding it the way that I'd like. And, and I'm still a nerd. I'm still a fanboy. So if there's an opportunity for me to put my head on a Ghostbusters figure, I'm going to try to take that as long as I got the money, because, I've always wanted to be a Ghostbuster, or I always wanted to be Han Solo. So to me, it's like that stuff never really goes away. And certainly doing the customization certainly brings that to life in a way that's never really thought possible.
There's a lot of things that I realize now getting a little bit older, seeing that, we aren't the only people that were into trying to do that kind of stuff, or there's a big community of people that do these things like customized figures and stuff like that, to the point where if you go on YouTube, there are videos showing, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I'm here to show you how to customize a Mattel Elite figure to, switch out body parts and stuff like that to make it, so that you can make it into anything, somebody to anybody you want. And it's a really cool thing to see that now, like you said, Andre, with the emergence of 3D printers, things like that, we actually have a chance of making figures of, different people, ourselves included, that we may never see mass produced. And it's a really cool part of the toy industry that there are so many people with these that want to do these same things, that we're to a point now where we actually get to see this. And it's, times are great to be a toy collector.
And, we're going to start wrapping up. I think just to quickly segue out of the topic, because I kind of want to end on this note. So we had the announcement about a couple weeks ago that Toys R Us is finally coming back. But it's not going to be exactly the way that we remember it. I think the stores, they say, are going to be a little bit smaller. It's going to be a little bit more of an interactive experience. Personally, for me, my thought on it is it was never about the buildings that we would go to get the figures, but it was always about just the experience of going into the store, finding the toys you want, and just that excitement, that feeling of just being surrounded by, those things that you want to take home with you. And to me, it's something I feel every kid needs to have, that enjoyment. And to take that away from us the way they did last year, I just felt would only hinder somebody's upbringing, because it's not the same if you're going into a department store like a Target or a Walmart and you only just see like one aisle full of figures. Now, I understand times are changing, everybody's glued to screens, and that's why maybe kids aren't collecting toys as much as they used to, but I know there's a lot of kids out there that still do. And just any way of bringing it back and having that outlet to collect an action figure or vehicle or a play set, I just think it's very vital for a young kid in this day and age. So what are your thoughts on Toys R Us's return?
I completely agree with you. It's funny because, a lot of times when you talk about collecting figures, or just collecting toys in general as a kid, it's never just the idea of collecting. It is the thrill of the hunt. The idea of going into a store with your parents and say, it's like, all right, kids, we're going to go to Toys R Us. Yes. All right. And it's not even the case of knowing that maybe you'll get something. It's the excitement of seeing who's there. The internet is a great tool for a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons it's a great tool, it's because it's given us the opportunity to know about a lot of these things before they happen. When we were kids, younger kids growing up, we didn't know these, that are growing up now listening to this, we didn't know what toys were coming out next. We had no idea. Andre and I had to find out by looking at the back of boxes or walking into a toy store and seeing what, figures were going to come out, or what was already on the shelves. I miss that feeling. I miss the feeling of being able to walk into a store, seeing what they have, knowing that I'm going to, be able to walk out of here with something that I didn't think I was going to be, I didn't even know existed. Toys, kids now are well versed at using the internet, so I understand that maybe they're not going to be as hard as we were, and maybe they'll know what's going to happen. But it's very beneficial to these kids to be able to walk into a toy store and be able to get these things, not just find them online.
That's dead on the money as far as I'm concerned. So that's pretty much it for us today. And as always, you can follow us at the Silver Screen Action Figure Podcast on Facebook. We have our Twitter page at SilverScreenAF1. If you want to leave questions, comments, or even suggestions for future episodes, email me at silverscreenafpodcast@gmail.com. Albert, plug your stuff.
So you can actually find me on YouTube. It's the Slam Sessions Network. Look it up if you would be so. I'd be very grateful if you would give it a little subscribe and like a couple of the videos that you like to see. And as always, you can get in touch with me on YouTube and comment below to see what videos you want to be made. Or you can contact me on Facebook. It's facebook.com/the Slam Sessions Podcast Network. I actually had somebody request an episode that I'm going to be filming today. So I obviously take requests. Whatever you guys want to hear me talk about, if it's wrestling related, I'll do it for you.
Fantastic, man. And also, too, for everybody that's listening, if you ever see any custom figures online that you like, share the pictures. Show us what you have. We want to highlight as many people as possible, different designers, different artists, even just the figures themselves. So please, anybody that does that stuff, contact us, share it on the Facebook page. We want to highlight you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to see your work.
All right, guys, so we're going to wrap this up. And as always, I will see you at the movies.